Boy, I'll tell you what. This Supreme Court run is a pretty Supreme Court law is a pretty tough one based on constitutional law. That's basically what it is. But we got two of them in here back to back that are two very good indexes, but it's very hard to understand. But both of them generally have practice. So if I was going to talk to anybody in my Bluestone militia, and I wanted to really make sure they had as much reasonable articulative speculation under the line of what they have. I think Homan did it with one of the committee meetings. He basically told her, I pay taxes for you other than you banging the gavel. You can't cite the rules of order in the Senate there that specify why I can't have this conversation. And Homan there trying to do things with the border and stuff like that. About it was their policies in terms of working in line with Homeland Security and getting back out. But at any rate, these are interesting situations. Let's begin with the first one because I think this would be the most reasonable idea. Before we get into the hard variable, which would be this next one here. Um, the reason that this is a little bit weird, see, usually I don't like the ones when they're actually conducting an investigation, but it's necessary because whether POV, the more cameras we have on the situation, the better for training it becomes, the better for data gathering systems. The more sites with free systems, especially from the civilians, the better. And in a situation like this, I would tell the cops, don't be afraid of being able to utilize one of these First Amendment standards to specify how good you really are as a cop, or a public defender of some kind. It's a little bit different with the EMTs. They're just not around there, and generally their vehicles are pretty clean, and there's a sanitary aspect of going through all the drawers as much as an AR in the vehicle or something like that. But as long as the windows are rolled up and you're not really breaching that gate, you might even be able to ask that officer to say, "Could I do a quick First Amendment audit on your vehicle?" And they should, hopefully in a free time, pulled over on the side of the road, just eating lunch or something like that. That's that idea, and you got to be careful with that lunch one because there's not really a schedule to it, and you got to be able to field all the time. Sawyer's got to operate sometimes outside of the 40-hour window and lunch break systems, and I imagine cops, EMT, firefighters, and everything else have to as well. It's just that upper echelon. It's a little bit more into the degrees when the guy brings out a camera on you on the mill about detailed information. You might think you're on the right track, but have other models to not necessarily the company's audit. They're your own as manager, but potentially the cost effectiveness of then watching that go downrange. And again, overhead cameras don't always specify this. Street cameras don't always specify this. POVs don't always catch all the angles. So line of sight is LiDAR. We want to make sure we get those 3 points of contact in the rain of fire to track the dragon. All right, but
What's that?
I'm sorry?
What law is that?
What law is that? You can't record inside of my vehicle.
What law is that?
and see, the Senate would have to define a law that's illegal, and it could never pass because just because you're a cop or even a private civilian, because that's the return on this, that you had reasonable suspicion to pull them over, and as a cop you're just open to it as an audit at anytime, spot check. These are not ETCs where you don't have dividend or spot checks at it. Dividends would be you have some criminal offense in the back line, and other ones. There was also one about a bomb threat at a police station that I heard, which brings up an interesting situation as far as liability of it all. I mean, I don't know if you had a bomb threat in the area, you didn't find a bomb, and as far as I know, you could be lying about that situation, so that's why we still have to maintain these audits. And it's how you gauge that person in the situation, I think, is most critical. But here again, just because it's a squad car doesn't mean that there is no legal precedence of an officer doing coke off of the dashboard. And looking into that squad car may be the only way to determine that, whether by dividends or on a spot check like an audit. And this is something that when we're upholding the standards, and I know I would have to give it up to work for the police station and the military like that, and that's something that again, when I think about it, I'd be willing to do for this cause if you really wanted to serve the people. It's just a higher standard, eating shit constantly, and just fielding problems for guys on the crew and things like that, as much as, just being a big brother or sister. But in that way, you got to make sure that, I'll happily walk around my squad car. I should have no problem with this. Unless my ditch patch tells me that I got to go anyways, that, there's no reason why I couldn't just walk you around my vehicle. Let you build faith in the police that come to the area, because in that way it is a cost. You can see that officer trail camera, body cam, or what have you, is reasonable to the processes of knowing how to detain a suspect or conduct an arrest without excessive force. Again, that's an audit to that process, much like why we make the mandation of POVs a must in that situation. So when we go through that, like I said, again, what's in the back of the squad car there, if that could come up to be an issue later, because, again, they do get doing this. I need to know that squad car number. What if I find out later that in this that you weren't really the police? That, there was a fake squad car in the region. This is why we do those things. But there's more to it than that when you consider the audit. Do you have an AR in there? Is your terminal and gear what it's supposed to be? Because that's what determines you not to be a fake police in that standard. That those frame rates add up. And again, don't be afraid to use these First Amendment TikTokers and YouTubers in this situation that could pose a lawsuit against the situation. We're talking $90,000, $1 million on your department, which is definitely going to get you lit on fire. And I wouldn't want any of my police in town or any of the Masons that I have to mess this up. We all seen, there's one about this dude punching an EMT girl because he was doing some audit. It's when those First Amendment fails that way where you're probably still going to get lynched for it, and rightly so. You don't just knock out an EMT. You can charge assault on somebody, you can call them in, but that's not something you can do unless you feel absolutely physically threatened, and that big brother should have no reason to do that. So let's move along a little bit.
What are you up to?
Things get much more complicated at this level. See, I would have to go on the internet and determine, or at least the internet, go to town meetings and things like that to not necessarily directly, pose this question whenever, but to get better insight of who to ask and how to ask the question about how do I find out exactly what the budgetary standards for a police station are. What's the rent? What's the electricity bill? How many squad cars they're supposed to have? Therefore, officers and other things, which we might not be fully able to do, but there are things from at least the First Amendment standpoint where this is necessary to do this. And again, this drives back from not necessarily a civilian doing this, but potentially a civilian with legal skills, if not a senator or representative, that's not going to let some force do this because we can't really determine that. And you got to be careful with that Boy Scout camp stuff, guys. It's one thing to say you don't really know what the cost is, and therefore the audit on the system. By being on the wrong side of the argument, it brings the whole department down. And that's not something that I would like to see for any of those standards, but I will put it down, I would personally at least, if it was a tyrannical gang by any other standards. Just because you wear blue, you could be a crip walker for all I know. And that's how you walk as a police officer, because if you don't walk like a police officer, you don't walk like an innocent person, even when it comes to that First Amendment thing, or Fifth Amendment, I don't have to talk to police. There's a situation in which the audit of that number pans out to be what derivative U or derivative T correlates to in terms of what we define that process. So again here, I'm not going to be able to know everything from what this standpoint of freedom is going to do, but it does discern the square footage of the building, in case that becomes that question later, the number of squad cars that they have, because they're budgetary concerns, the year and date, VIN number, and gear inside of that if it's in the parking lot. But it's still respectful to tell that the police that this is what you are going to do. And if at that point in time they violate your First Amendment right, you might have a much better argument. But it is still by I think it's the 6th or the 7th, right? That here's this grievance. It might be the 8th. That here's this grievance that was happened, and then assault and kidnapping, asking for ID and other things do come into question under liability for the issue. But that's something I really wanted to drill home in the issue, is make sure you're not doing this just for some lawsuit against the police station, because then we lose our defense guard. Super critical. And it's something that I wanted to examine inside of here.
Just taking pictures. Well, why are you taking pictures of our building? Am I not allowed to? Well, I just want to know why.
Because it's an audit. In that situation,
Terroristic threat happens and the building gets blown up, we want to be able to identify you because a series of events that have been occurring within the United States over
I'm
the
on
past
camera.
5 years. Yeah. 9/11.
Received a call from
there
a
would
state
be
employee.
an APB out for the video you have on them. We have facial recognition today. We have a lot of cameras. You don't want to be doing these tactics like
I
that.
don't know what it is he's reporting.
That's
wearing a
not
gray
what we're
shirt
trying to
and
do
black
here,
shorts.
guys. And in that situation, just don't use that authority of your Boy Scout camp stuff to get yourself in trouble.
Why would you do this?
Because it's an important American fundamental behavior or practice to conduct. Again, the foundation, just because they don't fully know, doesn't mean that they don't have the right to try. Doesn't mean that they don't have the right to try to go to a town meeting or a courthouse and observe the action. If that was the case, how do I really know if that person was guilty or not beyond their admission of guilt? And at what level of omission did they represent in there, especially if it's in with my own town or own district of responsibility, that I live here, so therefore I can be a peer even if I'm not a jury. Without that information, you're not privy to it except for what the will of the media represents, which may not depict the truth of that audit, or the rules of order, the district attorney having to prove these points before they go to trial because of some amendment. Now, most people, you do watch some of these things, sometimes they are illegal, but because they don't have the rights, a law-abiding citizen, you can't prove these. They never make it to the jury. And that's something really important to consider inside of here. So